Imagine an old village square in the depths of a dark night. Faces full of fear gathered around a crackling fire, screams rising as smoke pierces the sky. Welcome to one of humanity's darkest periods, those painful years when reason and faith clashed. This is a story not only of women and men on trial in the courts, but also of fear, prejudice, and power. Witch hunts did not start on the whim of a few witch hunters. It was fueled by social unrest, religious conflict, and a fear of the unknown. The authority of the church, combined with the concerns of the people, turned into a hysteria that affected hundreds of thousands of people throughout history. But my dear listener, this story is not a simple quest for justice. It is a saga that shows the dark side of power and faith. And now I invite you to delve deeper into this complex labyrinth, and together we will discover how witches are targeted, how the courts work, how societies so easily succumb to fear, and how these hunts end. But first, where should we look for the first clues to this magical story? Where do the origins of the witch concept lie? This is where our story begins. Ah, my dear friends, let us take a journey through the mists of time. In the dark corridors of the Middle Ages, we will witness the birth of a figure that inspires both fear and admiration in the minds of men, the witch. But this figure did not appear out of nowhere. It was the beliefs, fears, and cultural transformations accumulated over centuries that created it. Imagine that Christianity is still in its infancy. In every corner of Europe, the roots of pagan beliefs still run deep. In the pagan world, communities living in harmony with nature saw healers and wise women as sacred beings. Herbs gathered deep in the forests, prayers said in the moonlight, prophecies read under the guidance of the stars. It was all part of life. These women were the healers and protectors of their communities. But over time, these figures evolved from sacred to dangerous. As Christianity began to spread, old beliefs were replaced by a new order. Pagan traditions were seen as a threat. To strengthen faith in the one God, the church branded the old rituals as demonic heresies. Those women healers were now seen as representatives not only of wisdom, but also of dark forces. Prayers dedicated to pagan goddesses became, in Christian eyes, a sign of devil worship. But this transformation was not only influenced by religion. People's fear of the unknown also played a major role in shaping this perception. For the people of the Middle Ages, life was full of difficulties, epidemics, bad harvests, wars. All these disasters had to have an explanation. At this point, the figure of the witch appeared on the scene as a scapegoat, a being in the service of evil spirits, casting dark spells, harming people and animals. The human mind created this dark story to explain its own helplessness. And so, the concept of the witch gradually took shape. It emerged from the shadows of pagan beliefs and blended with the strict rules of Christianity to become a figure of fear. But this story does not end here. How did the church's view of witches change? How did this figure change from an ordinary folktale to a threatening threat? These questions, my dear friends, call us deep into the next chapter. Ah, dear listeners, we will now begin a story that takes us back to a complex and turbulent period of the Middle Ages. It is a story shaped not only by rumors whispered in the dark woods, but also by decisions that echoed within the stone walls of the church. The 13th century was a time when the Christian world was driven by an instinct for self-preservation. The fight against heresy had become the Church's primary goal. But in the shadow of this struggle, the first sparks of a dark period, which we know today as the witch hunts, were also being lit. At that time, Europe was a world where religion was at the center of the social order. But this order was being tested not only by external threats, but also by internal cracks. In the eyes of the Church, heresy was not just a theological error, but a rebellion against God's order. Fighting heresy was therefore not only a matter of faith, but also a social duty. It was in this context that the Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocentius III in the early 13th century, was not only a war against the Cathar heretics, but also an attempt by the Church to rebuild its own authority. The Logistatists. During this period, however, accusations of heresy were not only directed against organized groups. In local communities, individuals could also face these accusations. Women in particular were targeted for not conforming to social norms or for challenging a particular authority. These women were often social marginalized, such as healers or widows. Their knowledge and independence was perceived as a threat to the order of society. When the Church developed a more systematic approach to combat heresy, the Inquisition courts came into play. Although these tribunals were initially set up to try religious heresy, over time they also became part of witch trials. The first witch trials were often cases that questioned the fine line between witchcraft and heresy. In these cases, the accused were accused of collaborating with the devil through magic. The courts used coercion and torture to extract confessions to support these accusations. To give one example, in the late 13th century, the case of a group of women accused of witchcraft in the Rhine region of Germany caused a great stir. These women were blamed for disasters such as bad harvests and disease. Court records alleged that these women had made a pact with the devil and were harming society through witchcraft. These trials were a harbinger of the witch hunts that would later sweep Europe. But wait, my dear friends, this story does not end here. Witch accusations were not limited to individual cases. Over time, these accusations turned into a social panic and mass hysteria. But how did these accusations become a frenzy that swept across Europe? The answer to this question awaits us in the next chapter. Dear listeners, I take you now to a story that echoes in the dark corners of Europe, a story in which not only fear, but also ignorance and power were used as a tool. The year was 1487. Europe was in the last throes of the Middle Ages and in the throes of a new era. While the bright ideas of the Renaissance had yet to sweep the continent, dark beliefs and fears still dominated the minds. It was during this period that a book was published that would go down in human history as a black stain, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. This book was written by two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger. But my dear friends, this was not just a book. It was a guide on how to recognize, judge, and punish witches. Kramer and Sprenger took the Church's anti-heresy policies one step further and made a powerful argument that witches were the greatest threat to the order of society. To them, witches were not just individual sinners, but agents of the devil on earth. The book consisted of three main parts. The first part was a theological and philosophical defense of the existence of witches. It was full of arguments that tried to prove that witches collaborated with the devil and used supernatural powers. The second chapter gave detailed information on how to recognize witches. Here, the symptoms of witchcraft, the physical characteristics and behavior of witches were described in detail. In the third and most horrifying chapter, the methods of how to try and punish witches were described. It was argued that torture should be used as a legitimate method to extract confessions from witches. Malleus Maleficarum caused a great controversy at the time of its publication. At first, even the Church distanced itself from its contents. Over time, however, it was adopted as a guide, especially by local authorities and the Inquisition courts. The book established a standardized procedure for how witch accusations should be handled. These standards have led to a cycle of atrocities, often destroying the lives of innocent people. Dear friends, the impact of this book was not only theoretical. Malleus Maleficarum institutionalized witch hunts. Witch hunters now traveled through villages and towns, using this book as a guide, systematically managing accusations of witchcraft. Based on this guide, the witch trials established a horrific justice system full of torture and executions. People would accuse their neighbors or acquaintances of witchcraft on the slightest suspicion, and the accused would be convicted before they had a chance to defend themselves. But wait, dear listeners, our story does not end here, because the wave of fear created by this book has swept across Europe, not just a few villages or towns. So how did these witch hunts turn into such a frenzy? Why did people become unable to trust even their own neighbors? We will look for answers to these questions in the next chapter. My dear friends, we are now immersed in a story that takes us back to the turbulent, restless, and yet fearful days of the 16th century. Imagine the bells echoing through the streets of Europe, the crowds gathering in the squares, and the anxiety growing in the minds of the people. This was a story not only of beliefs, but also of power struggles and social unrest. As the storm of the Reformation swept across the continent, the counter-Reformation efforts of the Catholic Church created an equally powerful wave. In this turbulent environment, witch trials rose rapidly as a tool of fear and mistrust. The Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in defiance of the Church, shook not only the religious but also the social structure of Europe. The authority of the Church was being questioned, the foundations of the old order were crumbling, and people were trying to find their way in a world where their beliefs and identities took on new meaning. But this quest for liberation brought with it great chaos. At a time when everyone was questioning their faith, fears spread rapidly that the devil and his agents on earth, witches, were leading people astray. Social unrest was not limited to religious conflicts. Europe in the 16th century was plagued by famines, wars, and economic crises. People were looking for a culprit for their suffering and disasters. Crops drying up in the fields, animals getting sick, or a child suddenly dying fueled fears that demonic forces were at work. People began to blame witches for such disasters. Women in particular became targets of public anger and fear. During this period, the witch trials turned into a theater. People on trial often faced accusations from their own neighbors or relatives. Torture became a standard method of extracting confessions. People were forced to admit their guilt under brutal interrogation, and these confessions led to the accusations of other innocent people. It was a cycle. Once started, it was almost impossible to stop. This great conflict between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation was not only a religious but also a political battlefield. It became impossible to decide which side was the true way of God. But one thing was certain: Satan was the common enemy of both sides. And witches, seen as the representatives of evil on earth, have been the greatest victims of this war. Now think about it, dear friends. Why were these trials targeting women in particular? What deep-seated fears and prejudices in society were reflected in the witch hunts? In the next chapter, we will dig even deeper to find the answers to these questions. Are you ready to discover the truth behind this horror story? Ah, my dear friends, I now take you back to one of the darkest periods in history, the 17th century, a century shaped by fear and mistrust, a time when witch hunts reached their peak. Innocent people faced horrific accusations and paranoia replaced justice. From the villages of Germany to the foggy valleys of Scotland, from the gloomy courts of France to the four corners of Europe, this madness wounded not only individuals, but also the souls of societies. Germany became one of the most brutal scenes of witch hunts, especially between the 1620s and 1630s. Thousands of people were accused of witchcraft in the territory of the Holy Roman Empire. During this period, the chaos and destruction of the 30 Years' War further fueled the witch hunts. War, combined with famine and disease, led the population to search for criminals in desperation. In regions such as Würzburg and Bamberg, courts tried hundreds of people for witchcraft and executed many of them. In Würzburg, even children were tried and executed for witchcraft in trials ordered by a bishop. Imagine, my dear friends, in those days of horror, when even the innocent face of a child could be accused of being in league with the devil. Scotland was another tragic scene of witch hunts. In the early 17th century, especially King James VI's obsession with witches led to an increase in witch trials in Scotland. The king was so obsessed with witchcraft that he even wrote a book about it, Demonology. King James believed that witches were one of the greatest threats to the kingdom, and the courts operated ruthlessly in the shadow of this belief. During the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1661-1662, hundreds were tried and many executed. The smoke of the stakes rising in the misty hills of Scotland darkened the souls not only of those accused, but also of those left behind. In France, witch hunts are particularly remembered for the Loudun and Aix-en-Provence trials. In Loudun, a group of nuns slandered a priest with accusations of witchcraft, causing a major scandal. In Aix-en-Provence, accusations of witchcraft fueled local anger and led to mass executions. In France, witch trials often became part of religious and political showdowns. The church and the state used this fear as a tool to consolidate their authority. My dear friends, many of those accused in these courts were from the most vulnerable sectors of society: elderly women, widows, people with physical or mental disabilities. Many accusations were based on personal animosities, jealousies, and social prejudices. People accused their neighbors, relatives, or acquaintances of witchcraft, and these accusations, once voiced, were irreversible. But wait, this story does not end here. Witch hunts have ravaged societies not only in these countries, but all over Europe. But one question haunts us. How did this madness end? When and how did people realize that the witch hunts were a mistake? We will look for the answer to this question in the next chapter. Are you ready, my dear friends? Ah, my dear friends, as we travel through history, it is important to realize that witch hunts were not just a religious obsession or a fear of the devil. They were also a reflection of the most fundamental problems of society: land disputes, famines, and class conflicts. Imagine an old woman standing in the middle of a village with a crowd gathered around her, shouting angrily. This scene was not only a matter of faith, but also an indication of the fractures within society. At the time, much of Europe was undergoing a major transformation with the collapse of the feudal system. Land was not only a source of life, but also a symbol of power and wealth. But this precious resource was increasingly out of reach for more and more people. Large landowners were buying or forcibly taking small plots of land from peasants and creating vast estates, struggling to survive. This is where accusations of witchcraft came into play. In land disputes, accusing an old woman or a lonely man of witchcraft was one of the most effective ways to eliminate a rival. Think about it, dear friends. Imagine that an old woman in a village has been tilling a small field that has been in her family for years. Her neighbors may have coveted the fertile soil of that field, but could not claim it directly. Instead, they claim that she is causing their animals to fall ill, that she has cast a spell that causes crops to dry up, or that she is in league with the devil at night. The accusation is taken to court, often resulting in a death sentence, and the remaining land goes to the accuser. It is stories like these that reveal the dark economic realities behind the witch hunts. Of course, this was not limited to the land issue. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was plagued by great famines. Long cold winters, poor harvests, and successive years of famine drove people into deep despair. People found it difficult to accept that these disasters were caused by natural causes and instead blamed supernatural forces. When a cow stopped giving milk or a field of crops suddenly dried up, it was immediately interpreted as a witch's curse. In a society writhing in hunger and misery, such accusations provided a kind of relief. Because once the guilty party was found, the people could forget their own despair and celebrate the punishment of the witch. But the tragedy, my dear friends, is that these accusations were often directed against the weakest and most vulnerable members of society: old women, widows, people with physical or mental disabilities. These people, living on the margins of society, often became scapegoats. Women in particular were the most frequent targets of witchcraft accusations. Because women were not only in a socially weaker position, but under the pressure of the patriarchal order, they were seen as a danger that could easily be associated with the devil. Class conflicts were another factor fueling these witch hunts. As the gap between the rich and the poor widened, social unrest grew. However, this unrest often did not translate into direct anger against the rich. Instead, individuals in the lower strata of society were turned against each other. A poor peasant could momentarily forget his own misery of witchcraft. In sum, these accusations were destroying the solidarity that held the lower strata of society together. So, my dear friends, amidst all this social and economic turmoil, when did people realize that witch hunts were not the solution? And how did this period of fear end? We will look for answers to these questions in the next episode. Are you ready? Ah, my dear friends, now I take you across the seas, to a time when the New World was still full of green forests and vast unknowns. In the year 1692, in Massachusetts, in a small town called Salem, one of the darkest and most tragic stories in history would unfold. This story would shake not only the lives of a few, but the conscience and future of an entire community. At the time, Salem was part of a close community of Puritans who had emigrated from Europe. The Puritans were a community that organized their lives according to strict religious rules, believing that God was watching over them at all times and not forgiving sin, even in its smallest form. They had come to the New World fleeing oppression in Europe, but they brought their own fears and prejudices with them as they built a new life in this land. The heavy air that hung over the streets of Salem was not only due to the unknown coming from the depths of the forest, but also to the restlessness within the people. It all started on a cold winter day in 1692. A group of young girls living in the village of Salem began to exhibit strange behavior. They screamed, fell to the ground, moved unconsciously, and said they were being attacked by invisible beings. These events soon spread throughout the town. People believed that these girls were under the influence of demonic forces. According to the beliefs of the time, the devil had to cooperate with humans in order to enter the world. This is where the witches came in. As the days passed, these young girls began to name people in the town who they said had harmed them. The first to be accused were women living on the margins of society, often poor or not conforming to the norms of society. A slave named Tituba, a homeless woman named Sarah Good, and an elderly widow named Sarah Osborne were the first targets. Tituba pleaded guilty to the charges under torture and confessed to making a pact with the devil. This confession was the spark that ignited the witch-hunting frenzy in Salem. By the time the courts in Salem were set up to hear these accusations, things were already out of control. The evidence used in the courts, as illogical and irrational as it may seem to us today, was convincing enough for people back then. For example, one type of evidence, called spectral evidence, stated that the spirit of the accused was seen in the dreams or visions of the victims. With this kind of evidence, it was almost impossible to prove his innocence. As the trials continued, the number of accused grew rapidly. People started accusing their neighbors, even their own family members. Fear gripped the whole town. No one was safe, because accusations could be made in a completely arbitrary way. In total, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and 20 were executed. More than 400 were hanged to death. But what was more horrible was that these people lost their lives for no crime. In essence, it became, and how did this tragedy end? Ah, my dear friends, humanity is always slow to learn from its mistakes. The witch trials in Salem went so far as to finally shake the public conscience. The deaths of innocent people sent a wave of regret through society. The courts were closed and many of those accused were released. but this could not bring back the lives lost. This event left a deep mark not only in Salem, but across America. The witch trials went down in history as an example of how people's fears and prejudices can lead to disaster. However, one question still lingers in the wake of this tragedy. How did people become so frightened and panicked? And did this fear reappear in other forms later in history? I look forward to seeing you in the next installment, where we will pursue these questions. Get ready, my dear friends. My dear friends, throughout history, humanity has shown countless times how ruthless it can be when gripped by fear and ignorance. However, what happened during the witch trials is one of the darkest examples of this cruelty. Now I will take you to those cold courtrooms, those torture chambers, between stone walls, where people confront their own conscience. One of the most striking and chilling aspects of the witch hunts were the methods used to extract confessions from the accused. These methods were filled with a brutality that shattered not only bodies, but also souls. From the Middle Ages onwards, all over Europe, men and women alleged to be witches were subjected to inhuman tortures as they were forced to admit their guilt. The purpose of these tortures was not only to extract a confession, but also to allay public fears, to show that witchcraft was being fought, and to reinforce the authority of the courts. The methods of torture used in the courts were characterized by a terrible creativity. Accused persons were usually interrogated in dark and isolated rooms, not in public view. Ropes binding their hands and feet, torture devices that broke their bones, and sometimes even starvation and dehydration for days at a time were used to destroy the accused's power to resist. One of these methods was a torture device known as the witch's chair. This chair, made of iron, would require the accused to sit for hours, and the spikes underneath would cause excruciating pain to the body. But the most horrifying aspect of torture was that the person was forced to blame others, not just themselves. Those who were unable to endure the torture often accused innocent neighbors, friends, or family members of being witches in order to save themselves. This chain of accusations created a great deal of distrust within the community and led to further witch hunts. The role of confessions in the courts was a mirror of a system in which justice was completely perverted. When an accused person confessed, these confessions were accepted by the court as conclusive evidence. However, the fact that these confessions were obtained under torture was ignored. A person who confessed under torture was often executed as a witch, while those who did not confess were subjected to longer and more painful torture. In such an environment, it became almost impossible to prove his innocence. Another horrific method was the buoyancy test. The accused person was tied hand and foot and thrown into the water. If she sank, she was presumed innocent. If she floated, she was a witch. Those who were found to be innocent would usually have already drowned. Such practices showed how cruel and irrational the witch trials were. But my dear friends, the role of torture and coerced confessions in the courts has deeply wounded not only the fate of the accused individuals, but also the conscience of society. When people began to question whether such methods were right, the witch hunts would begin to come to an end. But how soon did this questioning come? And how many innocent lives have been lost so far? Now, in the next chapter, we will talk about what kind of social transformation took place in the shadow of these tortures, and how consciences reacted to this dark period. But was humanity able to learn from its mistakes? Let's discover it together. Saint-Delier. My dear friends, let's talk a little bit about witch hunters and the inner and social motivations that shape their psyche and lead them to undertake this terrible task. Because in every story, behind the hands of cruelty lies a human being. And where there is a human being, fears, beliefs, and interests are intertwined. It was in such complexity that the story of the witch hunters was born. At first glance, witch hunters seemed to be the chosen ones in society. But did this elitism really give them privileges, or did it make them puppets? Mostly under the auspices of the church and the royal courts, they believed they were carrying out an almost sacred mission. They wanted to be seen as superior men, with a sense of right and wrong, chosen to purify society with their authority. But rather than a search for justice that soothed their consciences, this mission became a means of projecting their own fears onto others. Believe me, for them witch hunting was not just a job, it was a duty, sometimes even a passion. Most witch hunters were ordinary people who rose through the ranks. Some were priests, some were lawyers, some were simply village folk who had become favorites of the local authorities. But some of them had become professional hunters, specializing in finding and judging witches. They relied on books and carried works like the Malleus Maleficarum, like a holy guide. This book provided them with a roadmap on how to identify witches, extract their confessions through torture, and how to punish them. Every page was filled with methods that hurt innocent people. But the hunters who used this knowledge saw themselves as servants who were only doing God's bidding. They were drawn into their own mind games, believing in things like the stains they said were the sign of God, the invisible demonic companions of witches. My dear friends, you must remember that these people were the mirror of their society. When a village or town suffered a famine, epidemic spread, or there was a bad harvest, public frustration became an opportunity for a witch hunter. In such times of crisis, hunters made a concerted effort to channel public anger towards witches. Sometimes the hunters were motivated not only by their beliefs, but also by financial gain and social prestige. The rewards they received from the courts, the confiscated property of people who had been declared guilty, made them see their work as a source of profit rather than a duty. At the height of the witch hunts, the hunters who tried a witch were adding to their profits while fomenting a culture of fear in society. But the most complex motivation came from the witch hunters' belief in themselves. Not only did they believe they were cleansing the world of evil, but they also thought they were protecting their own souls from the devil's trap. In trying to escape their own dark fears, these people were destroying the lives of others. Do you think they might have recognized this irony? This is where we must pause, my friends. Was a hunter really a hunter, or was he a wretch enslaved by fear? But our story does not end here, of course. What legacy did the dark shadows of the witch hunters leave behind, not only for the people they hunted, but also for the society they left behind? In the next chapter, we will discover how these trials were conducted and the role of torture. But when that time comes, you will better understand how fear blinds justice. My dear friends, let's stop and think for a moment. Why has the weight of these witch accusations almost always fallen on women? Why did this wave of fear sweep through society and target women so ruthlessly? Believe me, the answer to this question is a reflection not only of a dark period, but also of the prejudices of humanity throughout history. At the time, women's social roles made them a prime target for witch hunts. In the Middle Ages and early modern times, women were often seen as either submissive and holy or dangerous and seductive. This sharp distinction created a mixture of fear and admiration in people's minds. While women represented the power of nature through their fertility, they were also perceived as the threat emanating from this power. Older women in particular, widows living alone or outcasts, were seen by witch hunters as prone to collaborate with the devil. Standing on the margins of society, these women were much less able to defend themselves because of their poverty and isolation. Another reason for these accusations lay in the religious and cultural beliefs of the time. The church's view of women was influenced by an understanding based on the story of Adam and Eve. Eve had led Adam into sin by eating the forbidden fruit, a reputation as myth. This myth fostered a prejudice that women were more vulnerable to the devil, weaker. Malleus Maleficarum, the famous hammer of witches, argued that women were more vulnerable to the devil than men, and guided witch hunters with such views. Sadly, such texts had become tools to ease the conscience of hunters. But my friends, underlying these accusations were not only religious beliefs, but also an attempt to preserve the social order. In the male-dominated societies of the time, women's strength and independence was often seen as a threat. A woman who healed and cured diseases with herbs could be seen as wiser and more effective than a physician. But she was also one step ahead of being accused of witchcraft because of this knowledge. Because these women had knowledge and power that society could not control, men found it difficult to understand and accept their power, and therefore perceived them as a threat. The witch accusations were intended to destroy not only individuals, but also the tradition that these wise women carried. And remember, my friends, there were also economic reasons for targeting women. Many women were not only killed as a result of the accusations, their property was taken away, their families were broken up. The courts and the hunters increased their own wealth by confiscating the assets of these women. It was not only a culture of fear, but also a cunning game of expediency. But my dear friends, stop and think for a moment. Are these accusations limited to the burning of women's bodies? No. It left a legacy that demonized women in the minds of society. Can you imagine what a burden it was to be a woman in those times? And let me leave you with a question. At the end of it all, how did women's role in this dark history mark the beginning of a transformation? The answer to this question will take us to the next depth of our story. Ah, my friends, come, sit with me and let me tell you about that dark period when faith and justice were once intertwined, but at the same time trampled on each other. If we want to understand the complexity of the witch hunts, we need to know the religious and legal order of the time. I will tell you how the ecclesiastical courts and the secular courts differ from each other, and how these two powers play into the hands of the people. In the Middle Ages and beyond, the church was everywhere, in everything. Seen as God's representative on earth, the church had a say not only in spiritual matters, but also in daily life. The case of a person accused of witchcraft usually went first to the church courts. Although the church courts claimed to work for God's justice, they were not very merciful. Witchcraft meant swearing allegiance to the devil, and was one of the greatest heresies for the church. According to religious texts, this crime jeopardized not only the soul of the individual, but the whole community. For this reason, church courts often took accusations of witchcraft very seriously. But even though the church saw itself as a guardian of morality, it had some limits when investigating accusations of witchcraft. For example, the church did not directly use torture, or at least it said it did not do so officially. Instead, it used indirect methods, such as forcing the accused to confess through spiritual pressure. But how long can the human soul withstand such pressure? The accused would be forced to kneel before the scriptures and, between prayers and threats, to confess that they had sworn allegiance to the devil. While the church's ultimate goal seemed to be to save the soul of the accused by getting him to admit his guilt, many innocent lives were ruined in the process.